The unique, exposed position of Augustus Darren Finch, the quiet, meticulous sentinel guarding Eleanor Sterling, rapidly became an exquisite torture chamber of intensely conflicting loyalties and severe moral strain. He was, by contractual obligation, paid by Victor Sterling to ensure his wife's absolute physical protection, a duty he executed with the surgical, dispassionate precision demanded by his new identity. Yet, his constant, unavoidable proximity to Eleanor meant he was simultaneously and involuntarily made the keeper of her most explosive secret, the clandestine, reckless affair that utterly undermined the authority, pride, and psychological dominance of his powerful employer, Victor Sterling, the chairman. Darren's daily life was less a job and more a precarious tightrope walk over an abyss of guaranteed betrayal and certain violence. He had systematically purged all subjective emotion from his calculated existence, having embraced the cold sanctity of the transactional contract as his shield, but the profound human messiness of the situation began, inevitably, to erode the edges of his meticulously maintained detachment. He knew, with the absolute, cold-blooded certainty of a man who calculated catastrophic risk for a living, that this secret was not merely a private, personal infidelity, but a catastrophic, operational vulnerability that could trigger a violent, instantaneous, and completely unpredictable response from Victor Sterling, a response that would be designed not only to punish Eleanor but to obliterate the threat to his perceived control, inevitably dragging Eleanor, himself, and potentially the entire, fragile, camouflage structure of the chairman's organization into total ruin. Darren's intense professional observation of Victor Sterling, a man he had studied more thoroughly than any historical figure, had revealed a mind whose acute, aggressive paranoia was the primary operational engine of his vast global network. Sterling's immense power was built entirely on the foundation of absolute control, total information asymmetry, and the ruthless elimination of every unpredictable variable. He viewed the world, and indeed his own marriage, as a complex, impersonal ledger of debits and credits, loyalty and betrayal, and he maintained control through the meticulous cultivation of systemic, pervasive fear. Darren understood that when Sterling's suspicions finally coalesced and became certainty, the resultant outcome would be brutal, swift, and utterly disproportionate, a catastrophic event designed not just to punish the transgression, but to utterly obliterate the source of the perceived threat to his absolute dominance. The fact that the source of the threat was his wife, the elegant trophy and mother of his theoretical heirs, would not soften the blow. It would only amplify the scale of his calculated cruelty and the required systemic response. Eleanor, tragically insulated by her class wealth and a naive belief in her own privacy, remained dangerously oblivious to the lethal currents swirling invisibly around her, treating the affair as a private, justifiable rebellion, a necessary emotional escape from a barren, loveless marriage, utterly failing to grasp the crucial fact that her husband saw his marriage as a high-value corporate asset whose devaluation by a third party was an unforgivable act of treason against him. The moral and strategic calculus became acutely complex. Darren's primary, fundamental loyalty, the bedrock of his new, powerful existence, was entirely tethered to Victor Sterling, the man who had provided the capital, the structure, and the absolute power that allowed Darren to enact his long-term plan to protect Sarah. To betray Sterling, even implicitly to save Eleanor's life or dignity, would be to forfeit his entire hard-won position, instantly returning him to the terrifying vulnerability of his past, and crucially, exposing Sarah to renewed devastating risk. Yet, the old, inconvenient ghost of Augustus the poet, the man who was fundamentally and inconveniently kind, stirred restlessly beneath the heavy, corporate layer of his cynicism. He had spent his life observing cruelty. He did not wish, consciously, to be a silent, complicit accomplice to unnecessary, strategic violence. He felt a profound moral and intellectual obligation to prevent the impending disaster, even if attempting to do so carried an existential risk to his carefully constructed operational safety and his future. In a rare, cautious, and intensely calculated breach of his strictly maintained professional distance, Darren tried to subtly warn Eleanor Sterling. He did not dare to use direct, incriminating language, knowing that such a move would be instantly suspicious, untraceable, and could lead to his immediate, violent elimination as a compromised variable. Instead, he began speaking in calculated, oblique metaphors, using the context of their daily security briefings and route assessments to deliver his message. He emphasized the escalating sophistication of threat vectors, not external ones, but internal ones, those born of intimate access and privileged knowledge. He spoke of the inherent, debilitating danger of exposing a sensitive perimeter to messy emotional variables and the disproportionate, lethal price one pays for underestimating an opponent's access to private, intimate intelligence. "In this world of high-stakes capital, Mrs. Sterling," he said one afternoon in the silent, armored sedan, his eyes fixed with unnerving intensity on the rearview mirror, "the greatest, most devastating threat to a fortress is always built from within the walls. And when those walls fall, the destruction is total and absolute. One must identify and neutralize every single variable, especially the emotional ones, before they achieve critical, uncontrollable mass." Eleanor, however, deeply preoccupied with her own consuming emotional drama and blinded by the inherent, unassailable arrogance of her elevated class, completely dismissed his warnings as merely the intense, necessary professional paranoia of a highly paid bodyguard. She smiled vaguely, patronizingly, calling him fascinatingly intense, and told him he watched far too many spy thrillers, entirely missing the profound, life or death subtext of his carefully chosen words. Her dismissal only hardened Darren's resolve to remain operationally silent and simply observe the inevitable, cataclysmic collision between her reckless desire and her husband's absolute need for control. As the weeks bled into agonizing months, the atmosphere surrounding the Sterling household grew impossibly thick with unspoken suspicion, like a dense electrical charge before a storm. Victor's paranoia increased exponentially, feeding off his innate need for control and the subtle irregularities he noticed in the data streams related to Eleanor. The significant financial and logistical irregularities caused by Eleanor's frequent, secretive, and unlogged movements, the unaccounted for time, the need for private, emergency access to secured Sterling properties began to register as distinct anomalies in Sterling's operational systems. He was Victor Sterling. He did not rely on sentiment. He had his own dedicated security teams, vast networks of external spies, and sophisticated surveillance systems constantly monitoring every aspect of his life and assets. Sterling knew, with the chilling certainty of data analysis, that something fundamental was wrong with his domestic perimeter. He ordered wide-ranging, intense investigations, but his suspicion was initially directed outward. He suspected everyone: his CFO of massive embezzlement, his lead counsel of leaking sensitive data to rival conglomerates, and his longtime personal security chief, Cale, of running a vast, illegal side operation. He suspected every potential competitor, every rival corporation, and every past associate. He suspected everyone but Darren. Darren's impeccable loyalty to Victor, the product of his transactional worldview and his flawless reports, was the very mechanism of Victor's blindness. Sterling viewed Darren as an absolute certainty, a known quantity, a man whose unique brand of honesty was rooted in profound trauma, whose competence was absolute, and whose social awkwardness made him appear entirely asexual and non-threatening. Sterling saw the cold, ruthless efficiency of the rapidly rising operative, not the quiet, vulnerable man who still felt the phantom sting of a public slap from his past. Sterling simply could not conceive of a scenario where his most trusted, most rational operative could know of such a vital, personal secret and not immediately report it, calculating that the reward for loyalty would outweigh any other concern. Darren never slipped up. His reports were mathematically flawless, his demeanor unchanged, his records of Eleanor's physical movements meticulously sanitized of any context that suggested infidelity, yet completely accurate regarding her safe, secure transit. He had perfected the difficult art of reporting the technical truth while completely concealing the damning emotional reality. Yet, his conscience was heavily burdened by the secrets he held. The intense pressure manifested not as familiar guilt, but as a severe, persistent intellectual dissonance that plagued his sleep. He was a professional strategist, a man who built his identity on solving complex problems, now forced to watch a strategic vulnerability grow into an existential threat without the operational ability to neutralize it directly for fear of self-destruction. The sheer, exhausting weight of the lie, the daily deception of driving Eleanor to her lover only to return and file a perfect, neutral report to her husband was draining his reserves. He found himself utterly unable to relax, his powerful mind running endless, frantic simulations of the inevitable confrontation, trying to calculate the optimal outcome that would protect Sarah's financial future without condemning Eleanor to Victor's strategic violence. This unwavering, perfectly maintained loyalty, however, is precisely what made Victor blind to the depth of his wife's betrayal. Sterling reasoned, logically, that if anyone knew of a personal, intimate betrayal, it would unquestionably be Darren, the constant shadow, the hyper-observant guard. Since Darren's operational reports were consistently perfect and his demeanor unchangingly professional, Sterling ultimately dismissed the idea of personal infidelity in favor of a larger, more complex threat, attributing the domestic irregularities to corporate espionage or an external threat trying to compromise Eleanor for financial leverage. He simply could not conceive of a scenario where his most trusted, most rational operative could know of such a vital, personal secret and not immediately report it for the maximum possible gain. He had utterly miscalculated Darren's unique, cynical motivation. Darren's silence was not born of any affection or loyalty to Eleanor, but from a strategic, desperate calculation to maintain his own cover and avoid premature, self-destructive exposure to the inevitable violence he knew would ensue. The episode focused intensely on the mounting, unbearable tension, visualized through the increasing frequency of Sterling's abrupt, demanding calls, the sudden activation of new, redundant, highly sophisticated surveillance systems within the home, and the chilling, subtle increase in the number of armed, silent security personnel surrounding the penthouse. Darren was the calm, motionless eye of the coming storm, operating with a hyper-alertness that bordered on mania, knowing that the breaking point was imminent. He meticulously documented every single one of Sterling's increasingly paranoid operational decisions, unconsciously building a massive, detailed dossier of the chairman's destabilization and eventual systemic failure. The inevitable climax arrived late one evening. Eleanor had just returned from a final, reckless rendezvous with her lover, the high of the danger having worn off completely. Darren, securing the armored vehicle and sweeping the penthouse for perimeter breaches, watched her dismiss her lover's panicked, frantic calls with a weary, practiced air. Suddenly, Victor Sterling walked into the main drawing room unannounced. Emerging silently from his private, secure elevator, his massive presence creating a sudden, heavy pressure that instantly dropped the temperature of the room. He did not look at Eleanor. He looked straight through her and fixed his gaze entirely on Darren. Sterling had just received irrefutable, external intelligence, perhaps a simple, careless error by the lover, or a successful breach of a peripheral communication channel that had finally delivered the unvarnished truth. He was no longer merely suspicious. He was absolutely certain. He still spoke only to Darren, his voice dangerously low, his eyes fixed and unnervingly cold. "Mr. Finch," Sterling said, the sound echoing ominously in the immense, quiet room. "You have been impeccably loyal. You have been surgically efficient, and you have been honest in your service to the contract." He paused for a full 10 seconds, allowing his words to hang in the air, a silent, terrible prelude to the violence he was about to unleash. Eleanor, finally understanding the true, lethal danger, went instantly pale, her initial defiance utterly crumbling into raw, pure terror. Sterling did not address his wife. He issued a direct, chilling, and operationally specific order to Darren, confirming his final, catastrophic decision to act on his suspicions. "There has been a profound, existential breach of contract within the household," Victor announced, his voice devoid of all emotion. "A machine delivering an output. A variable that must be immediately, surgically, and discreetly removed. I need a solution that is both absolute and completely untraceable. You will prepare the necessary logistics and ensure absolute systemic cover. The failure to eliminate this liability will be considered a failure in your primary duty, and the consequences will be shared." The order was vague in its target, but terrifyingly clear in its intent, confirming that the strategic destruction was now imminent and that Darren, the keeper of the secret, was being asked to facilitate the final, catastrophic betrayal. Darren accepted the directive with a single, sharp, precise nod, his face utterly impassive, his moral conscience now completely submerged beneath the primal necessity of survival and the cold, powerful command of the ultimate power. The poet was silent, but the highly efficient, ruthless machine was fully engaged and running.